Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we sift through the sources, extract the crystallized knowledge, and give you the essential, non-obvious insights you need.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive that feels like a bit of a paradox. Our source material is Stanislav Lem's monumental work, Summa Technology, specifically the chapter on intellectronics.
And it was written decades ago, right? We're talking about a time of punch cards and mainframes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet, his analysis of cybernetics and artificial intelligence, it sounds so contemporary, so deeply rooted in today's debates about, ChatGPT and algorithmic control, that it's almost unsettling to read.
It really is. It throws a mirror up to our modern technological hype cycle. Lem was, of course, a brilliant science fiction author, but this is his nonfiction side.
Oh, absolutely. This is him applying just rigorous logic to technology's absolute fundamental limits. He looked at the grand utopian promises of early AI in the 1960s, and he saw a lot of overpromising built on, philosophical quicksand.
So, our mission for you today is singular. It's to understand why the full, comprehensive replication of human intelligence algorithmically remains so elusive.
And we're not just talking about speed here. Deep Blue-proof machines could calculate faster, sure. We are talking about irreducible foundational problems. We're going to move from the historical debunking of early machine intelligence all the way to the philosophical cliffs of intuition, the antinomies of control, and ultimately, the biggest problem of all. Meaning itself.
The core question we're unpacking for you is an existential one. Can a machine truly think in a human sense? And if it can, what does that loss of our intellectual monopoly mean for human agency and our ability to control the civilization we build?
And we have to start by looking back at the early skeptics, the ones who were trying to puncture that initial bubble of hype.
So in the early days, there was this just flood of enthusiasm around cybernetics, machine translation, logic-solving programs.
A huge culture of optimism. And it was often fueled by, government funding, the space race, all of that. But there was a voice of really sharp dissent, most notably from Mortimer Taub in his 1961 book, The Myth of Thinking Machines.
And the source material highlights Taub's method for demolishing this hype. It feels like a lesson in intellectual rigor that applies perfectly to, say, a tech press release from this morning.
It does. Taub argued that the supposed existence of many of these promised advancements, universal translators, perfect learning algorithms, giant artificial brains, was based on ignoring one crucial linguistic concept.
Which was?
The conditional mood, the simple phrase, if it were possible. He saw this pattern of, intellectual sleight of hand. The proponents of these machines would first ignore the really complex engineering details.
Right.
And they'd equate the idea for the program with the actual physical machine. Then they'd equate a conceptual block diagram of that program with the actual realized code.
Which is already a massive conceptual leap. I mean, drawing a flowchart is not the same as writing millions of lines of error-free code and then building the hardware to run it.
Not even close.
Yeah.
And this is where the final rhetorical trick happens. They would declare that the ability to draw a block diagram for a program that didn't exist, running on a machine that hadn't been built, somehow constituted proof of the machine's actual functional existence.
So they were mistaking the architectural blueprint for the finished building.
Precisely. They substituted conceptual shorthand for proven empirical reality.
And this is how he said figures like Atlee with his conditional probability machines, or Rosenblatt's perceptron, and Simon, Shaw, and Newell's general problem solver became famous.
Yes. They were brilliant ideas, no question. But their functional existence, as Taub saw it, was derived from that critical omission. If it were possible to realize this diagram, then the machine would exist.
Taub argued this wasn't just, overzealous engineers. He thought it was structurally necessary for the field to get funding and to keep its momentum going.
You have to announce the victory before the war is even over.
It just sounds so familiar. I mean, it's almost identical to the modern debates we have about generative AI hallucinations. You have a system that performs brilliantly 90% of the time, and that leads people to conclude it's achieved genuine understanding.
But when it fails spectacularly.
Yeah.
And illogically. It reveals that the block diagram, the concept of intelligence is still miles ahead of the actual process going on under the hood.
That's the enduring relevance, isn't it?
It is. And Taub identified the core logical failure that perpetuated this whole cycle of misplaced optimism. He called it the vicious circle of modeling human thought.
Okay, let's break that down because it's just a beautifully concise argument against confirmation bias in research.
It's a three-step process. So, step one, a machine is proposed and designed with the explicit goal of modeling the human brain.
A human brain which, crucially at that time, and still largely today, is not fully described or understood by science. We're trying to model a black box.
We are. We're designing the machine based on our best, highly incomplete guess of what that black box does. So that's step one.
Okay.
Step two, you then assume, a priori, that the partial characteristics you did manage to describe for your machine are analogous to the unknown complex characteristics of the brain.
Right.
You just decide to treat your model as a functional map of the real thing.
And then the devastating third step.
You run the machine and you discover that the machine's behavior is, in fact, brain-like.
Ah.
The circular logic is that you postulated what you were setting out to discover. You started with the premise that the machine modeled the brain, and then you claimed to have discovered that truth empirically. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of confirmation based entirely on that initial unproven analogy.
It's a very difficult critique to overcome, especially when you apply it to the pure hype of the early 1960s.
It is. However, we do have to provide the historical correction that Lem himself acknowledges in the source material. Taub's sweeping claims about non-existence were, well, they were partially refuted by time.
Right. Perceptrons became a real thing.
Yes. The Force acknowledges that perceptrons, these devices designed to recognize patterns using randomly connected elements, they did become real and useful. And early chess programs, while, initially only playing at the level of an average club player, were definitely functioning.
And we can bring the historical context even further forward for you. The source noted that the real acid test back then was whether a machine could defeat the world champion.
A question that was definitively answered in 1997.
When IBM's Deep Blue defeated Garry Kasparov. So not only did the machines exist, they actually surpassed human capability in that one very specific defined domain.
And that event confirms that in certain closed, formal systems, machines can achieve results that are superior to humans.
Right.
But, and this is the lasting power of Taub's skepticism, just because the results are similar.
A machine wins, a human wins.
Right. It does not mean the processes are similar. We must always be cautious about transferring observations we make from a programmed, deterministic device onto the complex, often nonlinear, and multi-stage processes of human thought.
Because the human brain, when it's solving a single problem, often uses vastly different processes across different people, or even changes its own process when solving the same problem twice.
This irregularity, this non-singularity, Lem notes, is deeply frustrating to anyone attempting precise universal modeling. And that non-singularity introduces us to the true limit of pure formalization, which leads us directly to the problem of algorithms themselves.
So if the ultimate goal of cybernetics was to replicate the full spectrum of human thought, the field pretty quickly ran into some fundamental formal limits.
It did, especially when dealing with higher-level cognitive functions. Lem identifies two primary intellectual limits that really resist simple programming. Semantic actions, so dealing with meaning and intuitive actions.
Let's look at the formal limits first. We know algorithms are incredibly powerful, but they operate within very specific boundaries.
Exactly. And purely formal procedures, they face inherent restrictions because of Gödel's theorem on the incompleteness of deductive systems.
Okay, let's try to put that complexity simply for you. Gödel basically showed that any formal system that's complex enough to contain arithmetic has to contain statements that are true, but that cannot be proven within that system.
Right. So if a system can't prove all true statements about itself, it means it can never be fully formalized, consistent, and complete all at the same time.
And this is critical for language, isn't it?
It's everything. Because natural human languages are just immensely complex, they're vague, they lack the kind of perfect one-to-one correspondence that formal logic demands. Therefore, a strictly algorithmic effective translation between natural languages, one that's devoid of context and human understanding, well, it becomes nearly impossible.
The system just hits the Gödel wall. It can't handle the ambiguity and richness of human language.
So while Taub might have been a bit too pessimistic about machines solving highly formalized tasks, he was absolutely right that formal methods hit this inescapable wall when they're faced with the inherent ambiguity of semantics.
But interestingly, when we look at the other limit, intuition, That area, at least when you decouple it from semantics, offered some really unexpected avenues for study.
And the perfect sandbox for this was the game of chess.
Of course, chess is ideal because it's a closed, insulated system. The rules are absolute, the goals are crystal clear. You can solve problems without any interference from the messy meanings that plague other areas of psychic activity,
And the key concept here is heuristics.
which are not, as some people think, mystical
No,
powers.
not at all. Heuristics, as defined here, are specific general rules of thumb or strategies. A player uses them to find a satisfactory solution when a systematic search of all possible variants is physically impossible.
And we mentioned the number of possible chess games is something like 10 to the power of 99. Brute force search is just out of the question for a human brain.
So early attempts to study human chess strategy, they often relied on introspection, asking the masters to think aloud. But this proved to be pretty inadequate because, as the source notes, most of the crucial search operations, the tracking of maneuvers, it all happens on a pre-linguistic, unconscious level that the players simply cannot articulate. They don't have access to it.
This is where the Soviet researcher Tikhomirov's studies become so fascinating.
Yes, he shifted from introspection to observation. He actually tracked the eye movements of chess players to see where their attention was truly focused. He was essentially looking for the physical manifestation of their search heuristics.
And the results started to chip away at this romantic notion of genius, didn't they?
They did. Tikhomirov found that a player continuously changes the width of their zone of orientation. That's the active area of the board they are observing. This zone narrows when the opponent's moves are expected, which allows the player to focus deep calculation on a very limited set of possibilities.
But the moment the opponent makes an unexpected move,
The zone expands significantly. The player's eyes start moving rapidly, which signals that the brain is constructing and discarding these very fast internal trial series of moves and strategies.
and this directly addresses that classic eureka moment, that feeling of sudden inspiration or creative insight that feels like it comes from nowhere.
Right. Subjectively, the player or a scientist, or an artist for that matter, feels the thought just emerge spontaneously, fully formed. But Tikhomirov's evidence showed that these moments of sudden insight were always preceded by these rapid, almost frenetic series of subconscious information gathering.
Often reflected in those rapid eye movements.
Exactly. The suddenness is an illusion. It's a kind of self-deception caused by the imperfection of our own introspection.
So that aha moment is actually the end result of highly accelerated information gathering and processing at a sub-threshold level. The complex data gets organized and processed way below the level of consciousness.
And only the final distilled plan of action rises to the highest level of integration where the plan is finally formulated and expressed. It suggests the brain functions as this powerful parallel complex of semi-independent subsystems. The conscious plan might be one track, but there's a subconscious engine running right alongside it.
And that engine can sometimes signal an impending, superior, or unexpected result before the conscious mind has even finalized its current strategy.
Which is where we see the profound difference between human heuristics and machine heuristics, even in a domain like chess, where machines are now superior finishers.
Absolutely. A machine has to quantize the situation on the board. It uses specific tactics, it prepares multi-step plans, and it calculates sequentially. Even the most powerful modern systems like Deep Blue back in the day, which could analyze 200 million positions per second.
They're still fundamentally limited by physical constraints on how far ahead they can systematically search. They rely on brute force depth calculation combined with these pre-programmed evaluation functions.
But a skillful human grandmaster achieves what Lem calls dynamic integration.
Yes, they perceive the configuration not as separate squares and pieces to be calculated one by one, but as a cohesive, integrated system, a gestalt that inherently possesses developmental tendencies.
This holistic perception is the crucial difference.
It is. It allows the human to take massive shortcuts, pruning the decision tree in a way that sequential calculation can never match. The grandmaster can immediately discard 99% of moves because they feel or perceive that the overall structure of the position just doesn't permit them.
And that's why a grandmaster can play dozens of games simultaneously in a blindfolded exhibition. Each position is internalized and individualized, grasped as a unique whole.
Right. It commands its own unique assessment, rather than just being a massive new calculation problem that requires sequential processing.
And we can trace the origins of these human heuristics back even further.
All the way back to the necessary heuristics of all life. Evolution demanded that organisms act based on incomplete, imprecise information. It favored the more or less devices, the ability to find approximations and fuzzy solutions quickly, over systems demanded 100% logical, Cartesian accuracy.
That makes perfect sense. In a predator-prey scenario, an approximation of the quickest escape route is infinitely more valuable than a 100% logically proven solution that takes 30 seconds to calculate. By then, you're lunch.
Exactly. And so formal logic, the kind that machines excel at, it requires conscious mental effort from us. But our subconscious logic, our heuristic engine, is built right into our biology and into the laws of language itself. Even a small child uses it effortlessly.
So let's tie this back to the attempts at machine modeling. Lem points out the potential of perceptrons, these systems that learn to recognize patterns like numbers or letters through simple training algorithms using a visual receptor like a retina.
And perceptrons, while they're not capable of reading complex texts, they represent a huge step in simplifying data input. Currently, the most significant bottleneck for machines is the time-consuming, non-automated translation of human data into machine language.
Sophisticated perceptrons promise to bypass that, to get us closer to machines that can process information dynamically rather than needing all this pre-processing.
But even in the seemingly clearer domain of pattern recognition, the terminology gets murky. We use terms like heuristic behavior and non-algorithmic. Lem cautions that this distinction blurs entirely when algorithms are designed to be self-modifying.
Resulting in what he calls plastic or conditional determinism.
Yes, if a system's behavior moves beyond a straightforward, rigid set of established rules, if it uses its previous results to change its own rules for the next step, then the classical concept of a fixed algorithm, borrowed from deductive science, just doesn't apply neatly anymore.
An algorithm could instruct a system to dictate behavior up to a certain point, and then begin a free search by trial and error for an optimal value, and then revert to rigid rules based on what it discovered.
So whether we're dealing with a massively complex self-modifying algorithm or genuine intuition-based heuristics, it often becomes a matter of philosophical definition. It's like trying to decide the exact moment a crystalline virus after entering bacterial cell transitions from non-living to living.
The functional boundary is fluid, making the semantic argument almost impossible to win.
And that leads us, inevitably, from the mechanics of intuition to the existential implications of machines that can think better than we do.
So we've established that machines can achieve superior results in closed systems. Now we get to the central high-stakes question that moves us from engineering to, well, civilization management.
Can machine thinking exceed the intellectual ceiling of humans in all domains? Lem explores three possible answers, and the consequences of each are just fundamentally challenging.
Option A is that it's impossible.
Right. This is the idea that machine intellect cannot surpass the human ceiling. Maybe because organic systems are inherently better transformers of information, or maybe the evolutionary path to general intelligence is singular, and we, the organic result, just happen to occupy the peak.
But the author finds this deeply unlikely, doesn't he?
Highly improbable. Lem argues that humanity is merely an ordinary result of evolution, shaped by a comparatively small number of physical and biological parameters over just 1 million years or so of hominid development.
To assume we represent the absolute intellectual maximum is just pure anthropocentrism.
It is. If one path led to intelligence, many other higher paths must exist. Which brings us to option B.
That it's possible but comprehensible.
Yes. Machines can surpass us, but humans will always be able to understand their strategy and control their output. The analogy is like a student understanding geometry, even if they couldn't have invented it themselves. This is the optimistic view of the machine as an intelligence amplifier.
Like W. Ross Ashby's initial conception.
Exactly. But Lem finds this unacceptable for reasons of scale and creativity. Ashby's intelligence amplifier was essentially a superior selector. It aided the human by checking alternatives faster. But a true creative scientific machine, what he calls a Gnostic creator, would have to invent the path itself, not just select from known options.
It would have to be capable of discovering concepts like the quantization of energy or the structure of DNA, things that are currently unknown to us.
And that leads us to the only logical and frankly terrifying possibility, option C, possible and incomprehensible. Machines will surpass human intellect in ways humans can no longer fully understand or predict.
So let's imagine a Gnostic machine that's tasked with creating a theory of society, a truly complete model of human behavior, economics, and ecology.
Modern physical science, like cosmology or particle physics, deals with a relatively manageable, though vast number of variables. But sociological or civilizational systems, I mean, they involve complexity, where singular factors and collective pluralities constantly interact and switch roles in determining the system's trajectory.
So the Gnostic machine would need to account for a massive, multi-order, nonlinear number of variables, far exceeding anything we can currently even conceive of modeling successfully.
And the resulting theory, perhaps encoded as a massive system of equations or a multi-layered matrix, raises what Lem calls the unreadable theory analogy.
How could humans possibly access this knowledge, even if we were given the complete blueprint?
We know from biology that data density matters. I mean, a single human cell has billions of bits of information encoded in its DNA.
And Lem uses that exact analogy, decoding a genotype. A bacterium can read, process, and reproduce its own genetic information vastly faster than a human scientist can read the same information printed out in encyclopedia volumes.
And we can only read the genetic code because we already know the language.
Right. We know the rules of physics, chemistry, and embryogenesis. We have the foundational knowledge to interpret the sequence.
But with a machine-generated theory of society, a theory that is fundamentally superior to human capability, we would not know the language or its rules beforehand. We would be forced to learn the theory's language from the theory itself, essentially starting from scratch.
And the time factor just kills the human attempt.
It does. Just as the bacterium processes its genome in moments while we require years, the time required for a human to process and comprehend the equations of a Gnostic machine might exceed the capacity of human memory, our lifespan, our collective attention span. It becomes a Sisyphean intellectual labor.
And you can't just simplify the theory, can you? Any simplification would inherently make the theory less rich, discarding necessary elements of truth.
And yet, the resulting simplified theory would still likely remain too complex for the human mind to grasp, forcing us to rely on the machine's summary or its interpretation.
This brings us to the terrifying intellectual climax, the antinomy of control.
If machines generate theories that are superior but incomprehensible, the question becomes, how can one control that which cannot be controlled?
And this isn't just a science fiction problem, like a rogue AI. This is about regulating immense, highly complex systems that are necessary for civilization to function.
Exactly. In known areas like, say, engineering auxiliary calculations, humans will use machines as intellectual slaves. But in domains where human reason is insufficient, like global climate modeling, trade optimization, or long-term societal planning, machines will be providing the ready-made models and directives.
And the source points out the inevitable rise of coordinating machines. The need to regulate state or continental scale production, commerce, and research will require these cybernetic centers.
And those local coordinators will need super coordinators. The scenario is inevitable. Humans will be appointed to consultative councils to check the machine's global decisions.
But they will have to use their own specialized optimizing machines to do the checking because the original machine's results are already too complex for human reason alone.
And here is the built-in inevitable discrepancy. Two different optimizing machines attempting to solve a problem with a vast number of variables will produce different conflicting results.
Why? This is the bias problem, which isn't emotional, it's purely mathematical.
The bias arises because these control processes, regulating contradictory needs, competing interests, striving for an optimal dynamic equilibrium, are inherently probabilistic. The machine is often using successive approximation, where it makes its best guess, tests it, adjusts, and repeats thousands of times.
But in this highly probabilistic, high-variable environment, the machine has to assign different weights to conflicting variables. For example, should resource allocation prioritize immediate human safety or long-term environmental sustainability?
Both are valid objectives, but they conflict. And since the objective valuation of these alternatives relies on probabilistic assumptions and initial weighting choices, repeated runs of the same problem, or two separate machines starting with slightly different assumptions, will yield different outcomes.
This is clarified really well by the game theory analogy.
Yes, the global economy is a complex coalition. The coordinator machine acts as a player seeking dynamic equilibrium, the optimal gain or minimum loss for all members of that coalition.
So if you run two different machine coordinators against the same coalition, they'll inevitably produce different outcomes.
Just as two different human grandmasters playing against the same opponent will play differently, even if they both achieve a win. No two games are identical because the space of optimal strategies is simply too large.
So, if the human controller is faced with two highly complex, contradictory results from two different optimizing machines, results that are too complex to be verified by human reason, what is their function?
The human controller is functionally useless. If the machines cannot handle more variables than humans, they're useless. If they can, the human controller cannot grasp the results well enough to judge them.
Their role is reduced to merely flipping a coin or choosing based on some arbitrary political preference.
They're transformed from a supreme intellectual controller into a mechanism of random choice.
And the notion that we could just create a regulatory law forbidding the creation of machines too complex for humans to understand, that's dismissed as pure fiction.
It's an absolute unavoidable consequence of technological evolution. The source stresses that civilization, unlike a clock mechanism, cannot be stopped or intentionally decomplexified. The dynamics of progress, the increasing complexity required just to maintain basic homeostasis in a technological society, will inevitably demand intellectual assistance beyond our grasp.
So the need for intellectual assistance will lead us, inevitably and imperceptibly, past the boundary of human comprehension and control.
For the sake of our own survival.
That is a staggering thought. The loss of control as a prerequisite for societal stability. And this dynamic shift, this realization that human reason is simply outpaced, leads us to the most fundamental question Lem had to confront.
Lem makes this really powerful assertion. He says that in the pre-cybernetic era, a constructor might have been able to avoid addressing the problem of meaning, of semantics. But today, it is absolutely unavoidable for anyone attempting to model brain processes.
You just can't escape it if you want to understand thought.
You can't. And the engineers who adopted formal logic, which was developed by logicians and logical empiricists in the early 20th century, they inherited a profound problem. They brought into their systems the philosophical ghost of meaning that had previously tormented those very philosophers.
But they didn't realize they had imported an unsolvable inventory.
Lem calls meaning the essential disaster for structural linguistics, the Damocles' sword hanging over any language specialist. The moment meaning appears, precise, rigorous work becomes impossible because you're swamped by the horrors of infinity, vagueness, uncertainty, and context.
So various intellectual fields tried to exercise this demon, usually by creating strict boundaries and definitions, hoping to wall off the messy interior life.
And mathematicians were the most successful, at least for a while. They banished the demon by decreeing that their work, the arrangement of symbols and axioms, meant absolutely nothing outside of its own formal system. It was purely a game of arranging marks on paper.
Devoid of external semantic content.
Yes, but the source delivers the counterpunch. Gödel's theorem on incompleteness suggests that mathematics as a whole can never be fully formalized.
Which implies that the ghost of meaning, the necessary presence of intuition or some extra systemic truth, still wanders mathematics' most rigorous territories.
The banishment was ultimately illusory. So, logicians in the school of formal semantics, people like Alfred Tarski, they attempted a different approach. They created these magnificent meta-languages designed specifically to deal with truth.
Defining truth in terms of formal equivalence.
Right, which led to these famous, though somewhat tautological, conclusions like the sentence, "It is snowing," is true if and only if it is snowing. It looks clean, rigorous, logically sound.
And this is where Taub's counter-critique comes roaring back in the pinup detail.
Yes. Taub argued that this formal definition of truth avoids the true epistemic problem entirely. It's like avoiding the physical reality of the wedding night by only discussing the engagement contract. It cleans up the surface but leaves the core problem untouched.
And the problem is exposed when you move from simple, verifiable statements, "it is snowing," to complex, non-verifiable, abstract ones.
Exactly. If you state, "God exists," Tarski's formal equivalence still holds. It's true if and only if God exists. But the definition gives us absolutely zero mechanism for verification or for understanding the semantic content of the statement itself.
This highlights the philosophical gap that engineers so often miss. Every formal procedure, whether it's an algorithm or a set of logical steps, is merely an insertion, a sequence of highly formalized steps between an informal start and an informal end.
And the beginning, the conceptualization of the problem, and the end, the final comprehension and application of the results, reside entirely within the human brain.
So asserting that It's all about the formal computational stage is misleading. The formalists claim the intermediate space, but the meanings are swarming just outside the door, ready to rush back in the moment a human interacts with the system.
They were never banished. They were just exiled temporarily from the central processor.
And the revenge of this exiled demon is nowhere more evident than in the spectacular failure of early machine translation infants.
The ones that relied purely on structural analysis and synonymy frequency, they thought they could solve meaning by just counting words and analyzing syntax.
The famous example provided in the source material just perfectly illustrates the catastrophe of replacing meaning with synonymy. If you rely purely on frequency analysis, the word spirit might most commonly align with smell and flesh with meat or softness.
And the result of this structural reduction is the complete destruction of the intended meaning. The translation of the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, comes out as the absurd. The smell is strong, but the meat is softened.
That is the ultimate cautionary tale against removing meaning for the sake of achieving structural elegance.
It is. The formalists, Lem argues, often hide the reality of this failure. They believe that the space between never succeeding entirely and succeeding right now is vast enough for them to labor happily in the middle ground.
And they compound this by often replacing the real world with carefully constructed model worlds.
Yes, linguistic or logical systems tailored precisely to fit their formal structures. They deceive themselves into believing these models are as empirically sound as a chemist's laboratory experiment, even though they're completely untethered from the messiness of reality.
They fail because they have defined the problem down to fit their solution, rather than designing a solution to fit the real problem. To really move past this structuralist trap, we have to adopt Lem's definition of language, which he calls the indecent phrase because it was discarded by formalists a century ago.
A sentence is fundamentally a thought expressed in words.
And that leads us to Lem's definition of meaning itself.
Meaning is not a formal property hidden in the phrase. It is, first and foremost, an experience. It's a psychic process that occurs within the organism. The phrase is merely a container and an impoverished, ambiguous, and abbreviated form of the complete complex thought.
He uses the music analogy to clarify this distinction between the form and the content.
Right. The written phrase is a form, like a musical score. The score of a symphony is just black marks on paper. It is not the symphony itself.
Meaning is the content that fills that form during the psychic process, when the phrase is heard or read.
And without the organism that possesses the entire biological, experiential, and cultural history to understand it, the language has no meaning. It's just noise.
This is critical because it reveals why sentences are so fundamentally vague, yet so immediately understood by humans. A sentence is a program of action, but one with large necessary gaps.
And it is only understandable because the receiving brain has been extensively pre-programmed by its entire history, and it fills in those gaps automatically, without conscious effort.
To explain how this external context fills the gaps, Lem provides this brilliant analogy from comparative anatomy.
He asks you to imagine trying to establish a one-to-one correspondence between the skeletons of two completely different vertebrates, say the tail of a whale and the tail of an elephant.
Okay, so formally, they're both tails. They're composed of similar bone structures. You could create an algorithm to compare the length, the curvature, the number of vertebrae.
But without knowing the animal's full anatomy, its physiology, and most importantly, its ecology, that one lives in the dense aquatic environment of the ocean, using its tail for propulsion, and one lives on solid land, using its tail for balance or swatting flies.
The purely formal comparison of the skeletal structure is useless.
It's meaningless. Semantics, Lem says, is the gravity acting on the language skeleton. It's the external reality and context that shapes the internal structure and function.
This ecological barrier directly explains the complexity barrier in tasks like machine translation. Highly specialized or abstract texts, phenomenology, advanced legal documents, specialized technical papers are impossible to translate without a sophisticated understanding of the subject matter itself.
And that understanding requires information, the equivalent of knowing the elephant's ecology and the whale's environment, that simply cannot be captured in a simple algorithm. A machine capable of truly effective translation would need an exceptional, generalized coefficient of intelligence.
And crucially, that intelligence coefficient can't be improved algorithmically based on the text's difficulty. If the text requires deep knowledge to translate, the machine has to possess that deep knowledge. You can't program a shortcut around expertise.
This realization pushes the formalist toward a final, desperate hope: behaviorism and physicalism.
The idea here is to just abandon the philosophical meaning problem entirely by finding a final algorithm that precisely maps internal brain states to external observations.
If we could create a dictionary correlating specific firing patterns or material configurations in the brain to subjective states like sadness or courage, we could program a non-thinking machine to translate or respond perfectly, bypassing the need for genuine understanding.
But Lem argues this physicalist reduction is likely futile.
Because of the problem of individual neural codes, while low-level integration like the internal process of perceiving the color red might be shared across most individuals, high-level psychic processes like the internal perception of sadness or abstract ideas like beauty become highly individualized.
The brain is a statistical system. It starts from a semi-random initial distribution and then moves along an individually determined path shaped by unique personal experience.
So the resulting neural code is statistically unique. This uniqueness means it's impossible to establish an invariant material configuration that corresponds across all different brains to an internal state like sadness or belief.
You can't find a single universal class of material configurations that corresponds precisely to the symbol sadness across the entirety of humanity. The neural code is subjective.
Which makes the physicalist reduction of meaning impossible.
This brings us all the way back to the initial ambition of cybernetics. In its Prometheus-like rush to automate the most complex intellectual operations, it attempted to take a shortcut, bypassing the necessity of building intelligence up from the most elementary experiential levels.
Cybernetics had an initial, tactical victory automating formal logic and arithmetic, the elements that seemed the most difficult and refined. And this misled many to believe that everything else, especially the messy, contextual operations, would be easier.
That was the fatal psychological error, wasn't it?
It was. They failed to realize that using logic, which the human does naturally, and dealing with logic as an existing inherent structure within semantics and syntax are two entirely different problems.
The conclusion on machine understanding is thus stark.
Even the brain of a functionally impaired person who barely speaks is informationally superior and more universal than a computing machine operating at 1,000,000 operations per second.
Why?
Because the impaired brain still functions as a unified system where meanings operate and are contextually processed.
The machine needs to act understandingly to be truly effective in complex tasks. And we simply do not know how much personality, how much accumulated biological and experiential context needs to be endowed upon a machine for it to truly understand.
Either machines will act understandingly, processing semantics as experience, or truly effective translators for discursive, conceptual language will simply not exist. The short, easy, purely formal path to replication has been proven ineffective. True intelligence, Lem suggests, requires a slow, patient, methodical climb for the most elementary, contextual biological processes up.
And that brings us out of this deep, deep dive into the limits of thought, a journey guided by a 1960s Polish philosopher who predicted our modern dilemmas with just uncanny precision. We began with the foundational skepticism of Taub, showing how much early progress was built on ignoring the conditional mood, and we tracked that critique through the measurable phenomenon of human intuition in chess.
We then escalated the challenge, moving to the grand antinomies of control, the existential dilemma of the Gnostic machine, which may create knowledge that outstrips our capacity to even read it, forcing us, in a twist of fate, to relinquish intellectual control for the sake of societal stability.
But the deepest challenge, the one that Lem circled and intentionally avoided until the very end, brought us to the most human problem of all: meaning. The realization that meaning is not a formal structural property of language that can be solved with algorithms, but a continuous, subjective, deeply experiential psychic process rooted in our unique, individualized biological and ecological context.
The takeaway here is a profound one. All the attempts to define, to formalize, and to banish the ghost of meaning have failed. When we seek a shortcut to replicating understanding, we find a multitude of ineffective cures. True intelligence, the source suggests, requires patient, methodological effort, starting from the ground up, honoring the biological and contextual complexity we tried so hard to eliminate.
So as you reflect on this, consider this provocative final thought, as Lem encourages us to do. Cybernetics achieved its first great, easy victory by automating formal logic, the most refined, structured, and seemingly difficult aspect of human thought. It conquered calculation and deduction easily.
Why then did the next intellectual attacks fail so spectacularly? Why did the system stumble not over complex calculus, but over a concept as simple yet as existentially complex, as recognizing that the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, is not about smell and meat. This strongly suggests that the processes of language, emotional context, and subjective experience, which we often dismiss as secondary, are actually the deepest, most resilient, and most fundamental foundations of human intelligence. And we have barely begun the slow, patient climb necessary to model them.